Rosa says to me.
If you don't mind muting yourself, that would be great. Okay, so welcome everybody to Peer's August meeting. It's nice to see everyone. My name is Catherine Zoka. I'm co-chair of Peer. We start our meetings with a land acknowledgement. We're graced to live on the ancestral territories of the Manhasset, Montaukett, and the Shinnecock peoples. For those of you who are not familiar with Peer, Peer Progressive East End Reformers is a multi-issue grassroots organization committed to advocating for issues that impact all Long Islanders and all in New York and throughout the country. Primarily, our focuses have been on healthcare, housing, climate, and social justice. And we work through by being engaged in electoral politics and activist issue-oriented engagements. If you're not a member, we welcome you to join us, and I'll drop in the chat in a little while a link where you can join us, and we would appreciate that. Thank you. So tonight, we're really pleased to have with us a scholar of the Constitution to be able to talk us through our program, which is Crisis in the Courts, The Way Forward. Larry Goldstone will be with us, and CD3 candidate Melanie D'Arrigo will be joining us in the second half of our program. I'd like to thank our co-sponsors. We have many of them: East End Action Network, the East Hampton Democrats, Long Island Activists, NIPAN, R&R, the Southampton Democrats, and Suffolk Progressives. So what to expect tonight? First of all, the event is recorded and will be available for viewing afterwards. So it'll be on our YouTube channel that you can share with others. If you have questions during the course of the evening, if you could just drop them in the chat and we will get the questions to our guests. So we're going to start with Larry, who's going to give us a bit of a historical background on the court, review some of the recent rulings, and highlight upcoming rulings. Then Melanie D'Arrigo will join us, and there'll be a discussion on the way forward, which will be moderated by Catherine Levy, and then we'll have final announcements. So let me introduce Larry, who is with us actually from the West Coast this evening. He is an award-winning constitutional historian. He is author of On Account of Race, the Supreme Court, White Supremacy, and the Ravaging of African-American Voting Rights, which received the prestigious Lillian Smith Book Award. In addition to that, he's written several other books. I'll just highlight two. One is The Activist, John Marshall, Marbury versus Madison, and the Myth of Judicial Review, and 1865 to 1903, Dark Bargain, Slavery, Profits, and the Struggle for the Constitution. So it's a real treat to have Larry with us tonight, and I think he's going to get us started by just giving us perhaps a little historical background on the court, and from there we'll roll into a review of recent rulings. Larry, please.
Sure, and I'll start, interrupt, ask questions. If I start going down a rabbit hole, let me know. I'm known for that. Let me first start by saying that there are more misconceptions about the judiciary than any other body of government. If you look at Article 1, the legislature, which they kind of do, it's really long. If you look at Article 2, which is the executive, it's kind of long. And if you look at Article 3, it's like this big. During the Constitutional Convention, during the constitutional period, very few Americans viewed themselves as citizens of the United States first. They considered themselves citizens of their states first. And under the Articles of Confederation, the states had all the power. There was no federal judiciary. Most Americans did not want a federal judiciary because if you were in a case where none of the judges were from your home state, it would be like being on trial in front of foreigners. And the people in the convention, the delegates, understood the enormous resistance to having a strong federal judiciary or even any federal court system, so they punted. And Article 3 is only 6 paragraphs long. It does not say what courts, it says there will be a Supreme Court. How many people on it? Doesn't say. Other courts? Doesn't say. What they were doing was hoping they could get the Constitution ratified, which they could not have done with a strong Article 3, and then leave Congress to do it, which ultimately Congress did. The Judiciary Act of 1789 was the first or second with the Bill of Rights, things Congress did. The problem with all the holes, the problem with leaving Article 3 totally general, is that it left a vacuum for aggressive legislators, presidents, and particularly judges and justices to fill. So what we have now is a court system that was undefined by the Constitution and has evolved into an effective third political branch of government, and in many ways, the most powerful branch of government, because judges serve forever and they never have to be elected. They can be impeached, but that has never happened. One justice was impeached, Samuel Chase, in 1804, but he was acquitted by the Senate, and that was a Senate that was dominated by a party that hated him. The Jeffersonians had taken over. So it is an indication that getting someone off the court is a near impossibility. Now, one of the things, just as a sidelight, one of the things that you see when you read the debates is that the delegates never, good behavior, which is what Article 3 says, serving during good behavior, was not meant to mean for life. It was meant to mean as long as the justices didn't get involved in politics. So that is how it was set up. And over the course of 2.5 centuries, the court has evolved into this enormous center of uncontrolled power. Now, in the 1970s, one other thing, for those of us who grew up in the 60s and 70s, we say, well, you know, the court did some great things. It had the Miranda ruling, and it was a force. Alexander Hamilton in Federalist 78 said that the Supreme Court is going to be the people's branch of government, where minorities are protected and injustices are redressed. That, of course, turned out to be hooey. In that period of the 60s and 70s, when most of us grew up, the court was, in fact, rather liberal, but that was the enormous exception. The court has not been the people's branch of government. The court has been the defender of the status quo, the defender of minority rights. One other thing you should know about the Constitution, I'm not going to go into detail, is that the Constitution was created to ensure minority rule. The Constitution was not a document to promote democracy. Of the branches of government, only the House of Representatives was to be elected by the people, but they didn't mean all the people. They meant almost none of the people. It was all landholders. So in the first presidential election in which George Washington was elected, only 6% of the people in the United States were eligible to vote. And in a country of 3.5 million people, 42,000 people voted in the first presidential election. And electorally, it went unanimously for George Washington. So we had minority rule built in. The Supreme Court has encouraged and protected that minority rule and been a voice of conservatism for almost all of its history. So what you've got in the court now is the norm. Yeah, in some ways it's worse, but I wrote about a series of decisions in the 1870s through 1903 that totally disemboweled the 14th and 15th Amendments. And the court did it in almost laughable stretches of logic. So what we have now is not unique. And while, yeah, it's a bit worse, it is not that much different than the country has had to deal with through most of its history. So when you get the kinds of decisions like Hobbes, for example, and we say, well, you know, that was a terrible decision. Well, yeah, it was. But on the other hand, sorry to say this, but so was Roe. It was a terrible opinion. And Harry Blackmun, a Nixon appointee, wrote it. Using the Fourth Amendment was an enormous mistake. And so you've got this, what we have done is handed over, to a great extent, we have handed over the government to people who can subjectively decide what the law is. There was an old baseball umpire in the National League named Bill Clem, in the beginning of the early 20th century, and a player slid into home and he was safe, and Clem called him out. And he said, I was safe. And Clem said, if I say you're out, you're out. And what we have now is that kind of situation. If the court says, for example, that the Second Amendment was about private ownership of weapons, which is absurd. And if you read, what did they put the first clause in about a militia? So what we've got is a very difficult situation that can only be solved, redressed, by changing the makeup of the court, which can be done by expansion or, maybe impeachment, although that's probably not going to happen.
So I'm sorry, Larry. Yeah, let me just hop in and ask you, historically, what the composition of the courts have been. Have they always had 9? And talk maybe a little bit about how the court has changed over time. That would
it started with 6. And by the way, one of the reasons that they didn't put in, nobody wanted the job because you had to ride circuit. Riding circuit means you get in a carriage and you drive to the far out reaches of Georgia, which was a wilderness, eating bad food and staying at bad inns. So the first 2 Supreme Court justices, Chief Justices, John Jay and Oliver Ellsworth, there was a third guy who was in for a little, but he went crazy, Rutledge, but they went to go on diplomatic missions without feeling the need to resign their posts on the Supreme Court because there was no business. So we originally had 6, and that was expanded. It got to 9 in in Lincoln's administration. It was briefly 10, and then went back to 9. And only in 1869, when Andrew Johnson was under fire by the radical Republicans, who were then the Progressive Party, did they, by legislation, set the number at 9. So no, we have had a varying number, and Roosevelt's idea to increase the number of justices wasn't a bad idea. But the problem was that once you start doing that, how do you stop when the party that wasn't in power gets in power? And we can talk about that later. I have a way you can do that. But so no, there is no fixed number of justices, and we have had a lot of variance. There was, one of the things, we now have almost as many Catholic justices on the court as we have had in our history. The first Catholic on the Supreme Court was, anybody know? He wrote the single most vilified decision in Supreme Court history. Hint. Roger Brooke Taney, T-A-N-E-Y, pronounced Taney. He wrote the Dred Scott opinion. There was not another Catholic on the court till the 20th century. And only recently, and this is not to be anti-Catholic, but the Catholics, other than Justice Sotomayor, all come from an extremely conservative branch of Catholicism. There are a lot of them are members of Opus Dei, and they were chosen by conservative presidents and ratified by a conservative Senate in order to get that conservative presence on the court. So what you've got now is a situation where theology has become as important as jurisprudence. And that's what happened with Hobbes. And if you start to read some of the, there was a case where New York workers sued, Catholic health workers sued because they didn't want to take the vaccines because the vaccines were originally developed from aborted fetuses from the 1970s. And that case was thrown out, but Justice Gorsuch, who was raised Catholic and is now kind of an Episcopalian, he wrote a dissent that basically said religious liberty, which is now a buzzword, religious liberty trumps, you should excuse the expression, trumps other kinds of freedoms. So what we have here is a court that is becoming, in some ways, very similar to a court of the Inquisition. Now I'm going to stop there because I don't want to just, I can go on for like hours, and as my wife will tell you, I usually do. But any of you have any specific questions?
Well, let me tell you, but
yeah, go.
Yeah, because we want to go through a bit of a few questions here first, and that was great to give some background on the U.S. court. We're wondering, how does the U.S. Supreme Court compare to Supreme Courts in other countries? If you're able to address that.
There's not a real comparison, because the United States is one of the few countries that has a constitution that the court can oversee. Great Britain has no written constitution, that they work on precedent. France will have certain kinds of decisions. I'm not familiar with most of the legal systems, but as far as I can tell, we are unique in that we have elevated our Supreme Court to a position of power that is very, very unusual in world jurisprudence.
That's great. And I wonder about, though, the numbers on the courts. It's my understanding that many of the European countries have a much larger number. Would you have any knowledge about that, Larry?
Yeah, not really. I'm not really comparing. I don't do comparative law, but yes, I think in France there's more than 20. South Africa is an interesting case, because during apartheid, the court system was the only institution in the country that was considered relatively fair. So the court system in South Africa, and one of their very famous justices was named Richard Goldstone, no relation, they were a force. Even though most of them were Afrikaners, they were more of a force to ensure some level of equality, very much what Hamilton said in Federal 78. In terms of the other countries, I really don't know that much about them.
Okay. No, that's fair. Jerry just dropped in the chat that she believes that many of the other countries don't have lifetime appointments, which could be one difference between our courts and other countries' courts.
Well, neither do we. We don't have lifetime appointments. They
Please
just
explain.
make it up.
Please explain.
Well, when, again, I touched on it a little earlier, during the debates, Article 3 is bare bones. So they didn't know, the term good behavior was kind of a catch-all. What they wanted, what they were afraid of most, was judges mixing in politics. And in fact, when Samuel Chase was impeached, he was technically impeached for proselytizing from the bench. He was a Federalist and Jefferson's Republicans had taken over, but he was really impeached for being an active politician in Maryland. So that what they feared was handing over power to judges who would then be allowed to be political. So good behavior is, in my reading, although very few con law professors, I should say also that I'm kind of an outlier. I've got a number of very famous con law professors who read my work and talk to me privately and tell me how good it is, and will not publicly acknowledge it, because it is my, okay, I view the Supreme Court as the third political branch of government. And therefore, courts, case analysis, reading through the cases to try to determine what followed the law and what didn't, is, to me, in political cases, irrelevant. They are going to go in the direction that they wanted to go in. I'll give you an example. The major fight now is between the 10th Amendment, which leaves every power not specifically delegated to the federal government to the states or to the people, and the 14th Amendment, which demands equality in the law. Now, the 14th Amendment came later, so you would think that the 14th Amendment would override the 10th Amendment, and that the 14th Amendment guarantees of equal protection and due process would rule in a case with 10th Amendment implications. So now we go to Bush v. Gore. Now the conservatives, as we see, are very 10th Amendment oriented. Power to the states, abortion to the states, gun laws to the states to a degree. Where the liberal justices are very 14th Amendment oriented, equal protection of everyone, states can't do this, states can't do that. In Bush v. Gore, you had 5 conservative justices opt for a 14th Amendment interpretation, and you had 4 liberal justices opt for a 10th Amendment interpretation. The liberal justices said, no, Florida should be able to do what it wants. And the conservative justices said, no, the United States, this is a federal issue. Now, so every one of those 9 justices went against their own philosophy to go on the political side of what they were ruling on. So you got, it is a very difficult situation when you've got the law being so subjectively applied, where you cannot find a path that makes them adhere to what the law was supposed to be. One more quick thing. There's another choice between whether the law is language or whether the law is ideals. Conservatives believe the law is language. And again, you get back to very traditional Catholic education, where they do the sentence where they do Peter Abelard and scholasticism, which is totally language oriented. And then you have the liberal justices, who believe that the law is ideal. The law is a set of ideals. So if the language violates the ideal wins. For conservative justices, they take their refuge in language. And the problem with language is that it's totally subjective. So they can determine what language means in the 14th Amendment, in the 15th Amendment, in lawsuits and briefs, and that is a real problem, because what do you say? This is their interpretation of the law, but their interpretation of the law is the letter of the law and often violates its spirit.
No, that's great. Thanks for clarifying that. I wonder if you could maybe now address a couple of the recent rulings, in particular the EPA ruling, and we also really want to get to the upcoming ruling on the ISL. So
Sure.
Please, if you want to talk about the EPA ruling first.
This all falls into the same basket. The EPA ruling, if you are a 10th Amendment person, if you are a 10th Amendment devotee, as the 6 justices are, then you say the federal government is totally limited in what they can do, that the prologue, that the preamble of the Constitution that says to promote health and tranquility doesn't really mean anything. In fact, it should mean something, but to these justices, it doesn't, because states can't be required to implement or even allowed to implement certain regulations, which the federal government can't keep a state from enacting regulations, and they can't prevent it. So the state, if the states don't want to follow an EPA directive, if they don't want to clean up their water, if they don't want to clean up their air, then unless you can demonstrate that it is an interstate problem where one state sues another, which you can kind of do with air because of wind currents, then the federal government cannot intervene. Instead of doing the EPA, I want to do the 15th Amendment, because this is the principle. The 15th Amendment is very simple. It said no person should be denied the right to vote on the basis of race or previous condition of servitude, slavery. Now that seemed as clear as you can be. No person can be denied the right to vote on account of race. In a circuit court decision in 1874, a Supreme Court justice named Joseph Bradley, who was the Antonin Scalia of his day, said, "Nuh-uh, The 15th Amendment does not guarantee the right to vote. Only the states can do that. All the 15th Amendment can do is prevent someone from being denied the right to vote on account of their race. Now, that seems like a semantic difference, law, language, and ideals, right? Except what it did was it took the burden of proof from the state to prove that it had not discriminated to the individual to prove that he, and it was only he in those days, had been discriminated against solely because of his race. And that turned out to be an impossibility. So the 15th Amendment, the right to vote in the 15th Amendment, which could not have been more clear, which the Congress that passed it could not have been more clear about, and the states that ratified it could not have been more clear about, was totally rendered useless because the language was turned around. The same thing will be true. The same thing is true in Hobbes. The same thing is true in the EPA case. The same thing is true in DC v. Heller, which is almost a hilarious violation of Scalia's. Antonin Scalia wrote the 5-4 decision in the DC gun case. He's a guy who said, I don't care about intent. I don't care about intent. All I care about is language. And his entire opinion is intent. So what we are faced with here is a court that is absolutely out of control, able to do pretty much anything it wants to do without any checks. And unless we get a very aggressive Congress and a very aggressive president, and this president is not nearly as aggressive as he should be on this situation is not going to get any better.
So first of all, it's a great example that you just brought out about the case in 1874, and it, just another example of how if people want to do harm, they will figure the most creative ways to do it going forward, and we see that around us all the time today, including, I guess, the upcoming Moore versus Harper ruling that the court will hear about. Maybe not everybody on the call is familiar with it. Maybe you could give a little context about that and talk about what you see coming with that ruling, I guess, next year.
Well, Moore v. Harper is a case, there is a long debunked theory that state legislatures and state courts have no power to regulate federal elections. Now, it is debunked because if you read the Constitution, it is an absurdity. It was specifically, remember again, to go back to the beginning, people had their main allegiance to the state in which they lived. So the Constitution, the delegates of the Constitutional Convention had to be extremely careful about not doing too much. Everybody who went to Philadelphia in 1787 knew any meeting like that is about, even if it's a family powwow, it's about who's going to gain power and who's going to lose power. They all knew that they needed a stronger central government. The central government was going to gain power and the states were going to lose some. The question was how much? And in the end, they tiptoed around to make sure, because if the states lost too much power, the Constitution was not going to be ratified. So you have a situation here where the states were given control over elections. They were given control over, in the Electoral College, it doesn't have to be winner take all. We have 2 states that allocate electors by congressional district and at large. There is an enormous latitude for states to conduct elections the way they want. So this notion that the state legislatures have no power to, say, enforce an anti-gerrymandering act, which is what's going on in North Carolina, is just an absurdity. But again, then we move back to, well, so what? If this court decides that somehow federal elections are sacrosanct and that state governments can't, federal apportionment, this is not just elections, this is apportionment, that apportionment for congressional seats is sacrosanct and states have no power to control the apportionment and the drawing of districts in their own states, well, who's going to stop them? And so I don't know how the court's going to rule on this. I would say ordinarily before Amy Coney Barrett, this would have been a 5-4 in favor with Roberts joining with the liberals. But now, now it's tough. The only threat that hangs over there is Brett Kavanaugh perjured himself in his confirmation hearings. Not about the sexual assault. There's no way to prove that. But he claimed he never drank to excess. Now, it's a minor lie, but he was under oath. If the Congress decides to get really aggressive, he can be impeached for perjuring himself in front of at his hearings. I think he's aware of that. I think that Clarence Thomas, who is impervious, so this is probably a much lower probability, is aware that his wife could get him into serious trouble. But in Moore v. Harper, I am not optimistic that the court will follow the law. They did not follow the law in DC v. Heller, and that was a less conservative court than we have now. So if that happens, then states will be free to gerrymander to their heart's content. And here is another problem. States like New York submit their plans to an independent arbiter because their courts don't cheat. So what you're going to do is you're going to reward the cheaters, which is something I've written about. Now, however, if that really does happen, and in 2030 there is redistricting and rampant gerrymandering by the conservative states, the larger Illinois, California, and New York are capable of knocking off 6 to 8 Republican congressional districts. And if you add in places like Colorado, so what you would have there is open warfare, where one state's going to be represented by 1 Republican and 54 Democrats, and another state's going to be represented by 1 Democrat and 20 Republicans. So it will be chaos if the court rules as I fear they will.
So let me just, that in line with that, Tina asked a question in the chat, similar, but maybe a slightly different angle. What will be the consequences if SCOTUS rules that Article 2 means only the state legislature has control over the methods and manner of federal elections?
Well, they don't, say that again, only the state government, only the federal government.
So I'll read it again. It says, what would be the consequences if the Supreme Court rules that Article 2 means that only the state legislatures have control over the methods and manners of federal elections?
And if I may just break in for a second, sure. The independent state legislature doctrine is that only distorting the reading of the Constitution, I believe, that only state legislatures have rights to control elections, not the courts and not the executives in the state. And that, I think, is what people are so worried about.
What will happen? We will have chaos, because what you are doing is you're throwing down the gauntlet to every state in the union to gerrymander as much as possible and to limit the number of seats for the minority party. It is a constitutional absurdity. But on the other hand, John Eastman, who taught law somewhere, came and said that Mike Pence does not have to verify, could annul the election. By the way, that almost happened. In 1800, Thomas Jefferson was in charge of ratifying an election that he was in. And it went to 30 ballots, as I think you know, and Jefferson finally won over not John Adams, but Aaron Burr, because in those days, president was the person who finished first and vice president was the person who finished second. So we have had a situation where the person presiding over this declaration from the Electoral College has had an interest in the proceedings, and Jefferson, to his credit, Jefferson is very overrated. Jefferson he was great in many ways, but he was a politician down to his toenails, and he did not misuse his power, and he might have, because there's a great book by Bruce Ackerman. Some of the votes didn't come in exactly as they should have, but Jefferson did not use that power, and ultimately he won anyway. That's because of slavery, by the way. He is the slavery president. Without the 3/5 clause, he would have lost. But so what happens? What happens is total chaos. It's just every state. New York will no longer, the New York State Supreme Court will no longer be able to redraw a map. Nobody will be able to redraw a map. So whoever controls the state legislatures will do its absolute best to make this even less of a democracy than we have now.
No, thank you. I mean, I guess as Catherine Levy has put into the chat, the big concern is that, the state legislatures will be able to reject the electors in the presidential election. But this is a good point, maybe to pivot to with the second part of our discussion tonight, which is the way forward and how to maybe kind of right this ship. Melanie D'Arrigo, the CD3 candidate, has actually joined us. And this portion of the forum is going to be moderated by Catherine Levy. So I think I'll turn it over to Catherine right now, and we can talk about maybe some remedies. So Catherine, please.
I'm so glad that Melanie has joined us. Melanie, Larry has given us a great background on the Supreme Court and all of the things that make it less invalid politically and historically. And I'm sure that you would agree with a lot of it. Larry, Melanie is one of the few candidates I know, certainly the only one on Long Island, who has made Supreme Court reform a central part of her campaign and of her platform. And she has a platform that recommends several sorts of Supreme Court reform. And I want to begin with expansion of the court, which I think is the one that should have most currency for a lot of historical reasons. Melanie, do you want to briefly talk about the Judiciary Act and your recommendations for expanding the court?
Absolutely. And hi, everyone. So sorry to be joining so late. We're a little less than 2 weeks away from our election. So as you can imagine, we're a little bit busy, but it's such an honor to be here with you all tonight. As Catherine said, I am an ardent supporter of the Judiciary Act of 2021, which would expand the Supreme Court. Let me talk a little bit about what that means and put it in context. I don't know if Larry talked about this at all. And hi, Larry, nice to meet you via Zoom.
Hi, nice to meet you too.
Nice to meet you. So I know for some folks, and I'm sure we've all heard it, you'll hear folks say, well, that's really out there. That's really radical. Why should we do that? Then the Republicans are just going to do it, right? And there's this whole back and forth. But it's important to understand that since its inception, the Supreme Court has changed the number of justices, in fact, 7 times already. The last time it was changed to 9 justices to match the 9 circuits. We now have 13 circuits. And so the Judiciary Act of 2021, which is in the House, at least it's sponsored by Reps Nadler and Jones, they propose adding 4 more justices to make it 13, 1 to preside over each court. So there is some precedent to do this. The other thing that I think we need to really be honest about right now in this particular moment is, I know the folks on this call quite well. You've all been in the trenches fighting because you understand what's at stake. You understand that there is a extreme right-wing movement that is doing all it can to dismantle democracy at every single level. Right now, we watched over the last few years a Supreme Court become packed with ultra right-wing justices. There's no more legitimacy, in my opinion, to the Supreme Court. They're now legislating from the bench. This is not, what the founders intended for sure. And so, I believe that passing the Judiciary Act, and of course, we've got to do that while we have control certainly, so the Democrats can install the justices. And I'm not suggesting that we, install some ultra left-wing justices, but, the court used to mean something, right? It used to mean that it stood for justice and to be as nonpartisan as possible. And that's just not the case anymore. So I believe that passing the Judiciary Act would, in fact, rebalance the court. And I think that's really important for our long-term democracy and our long-term sustainability as a country.
So Larry, you, I think, have addressed, there's the objection that I keep hearing, I'm sure Melanie has heard it, that if the Democrats expand the Supreme Court, that then the Republicans will turn around and do that. I do want to point out that for 11 months, the Republicans caused the Supreme Court to be 8 justices because they kept a seat open on the court. So they've already manipulated the size of the court. But I thought that in a recent article, you had a great response to the objection that if the Democrats do this, the Republicans can turn around and do the same thing. Would you want to talk about that?
Sure. I mean, I agree with the 13, and for the same reason. That's when we originally had 6 justices, there were 6 circuits. But what you can do is to say that you expand it to 13 to match the number of circuits. You will not have another circuit unless the population grows. And until the population grows enough to justify a 14th circuit, and if you want to do it, the population grows enough to add 2 circuits, so you can always have the number of justices be an odd number, which is not in the Constitution, but it's probably more workable. If you put a population cap, then you prevent this willy-nilly expansion until you have, a justice for every 40 people in the United States. So I absolutely agree with both the constitutionality and the practicality of expanding to 13. And I also agree with doing it now. But if you have an act of Congress that limits it without the population expansion, then you have solved the problem.
So I'm going to get on to the political elements of all of these things in a moment, but I want to talk about the term limits reform, which Melanie is also advocating, and I think that Larry believes in as well. Would you talk a bit about that, Melanie, your belief in term limits for the court?
Yeah. And I believe in term limits across the board, frankly, for Congress as well as for justices. Look, when we look at the makeup of our current Supreme Court, or really any federal appointment, right? I said, we know that Donald Trump was horrendous for this country, but, one thing he did quite well for his party is install a lot of federal judges at the federal bench. And that is where these Supreme Court picks come from. So, and we're starting to see him install judges, or he did install judges that were much younger than we're used to, right? Which means they're going to have decades to cause quite a bit of harm. So I do believe in term limits. I think it's just as a matter of practicality and protection for our democracy. I think it makes sense. And I think that, frankly, most Americans agree as well. When you look at polling, that is, pretty consistent across parties.
So Larry, you have addressed the objection to this reform. This seems to be an objection to every reform, which is sort of the American way of saying no to everything these days. But the objection to this reform, and you've touched on this earlier, is that it is unconstitutional, that you would have to pass a constitutional amendment. Can you just circle back to that and say why you believe that isn't true?
Sure. The phrase, there's nothing in the Constitution that says justice is served for life. And if they say they serve during good behavior, and that has been interpreted to mean for life, and no justice, left or right, has complained about that because they actually like being on the court. But if you read the debates, there was an absolute distinction between for life and good behavior. And in fact, in one debate over the Senate serving for life, George Mason, a very prestigious delegate from Virginia, said they were talking about good behavior, and they say he made the distinction that what you don't want is to leave a phrase that allows good behavior to mean for life. So the delegates to the convention, including Alexander Hamilton, who wrote Federalist 78, which more or less outlines the court, they knew the difference. So the phrase good behavior to them almost certainly meant as long as the justices don't mix in politics, which Melanie, I did before, and the only Supreme Court justice ever to be impeached, and he was not convicted, was Samuel Chase, and that was for mixing in politics. So it is almost a certainty that term limits would not require a constitutional amendment, but merely an act of Congress. Now, of course, if it was an act of Congress and someone sued, it would go before the Supreme Court, and they'd all have to disqualify themselves because they are parties to the action. So I think it's very doable.
I mean, people are arguing that that might create a constitutional crisis. I would argue that we're already in a constitutional crisis, so we might as well confront the constitutional crisis. I want to get on to, I'm sorry to be moving so rapidly through these things, but we have limited time. We could spend a day on each of these things. I want to get on to one area where you might disagree, but that will be interesting. Melanie has a wonderful piece of legislation that she would like to introduce if and when she becomes a member of Congress, called the Pass My Paid By Act. And I would like you, Melanie, to talk about how that relates specifically to judicial nominations and to justices.
Yes, well, firstly, it's a mouthful. So paid by is a nice acronym. It stands for Public Accountability Information Disclosures Benefiting You. It was a piece of a proposal that I wrote when I ran for Congress in 2019, and I was looking at it through the perspective of ensuring more transparency for representatives, both at the House and Senate level. However, the times being what they are, this cycle I have built upon it to include a piece for the judiciary as well. It's interesting, Larry, that you talk about dabbling in politics. And when we think about the amount of dark money that is poured into the judicial system to get judges on the federal bench, to get Supreme Court justices, it's an unfathomable amount of money, and more than half of this money does not get disclosed. It's true dark money. We don't know where it's coming from because it's being funneled through super PACs, through organizations like the Federalist Society. So what we start to see is, those who have a special interest, if you will, in placing a justice on the court, they spend countless amounts of money. They get their rich buddies to also put money in. And then it's really hard to compete with that, right? So there is a little bit already mixing, I believe, of judicial nominees and politics. Just sort of depends on the way you look at it. So my Paid By Act, what it would do for the judicial system, there would be several things. One, all of these, dark money super PACs, all of the money that is going toward a judicial nomination would have to be disclosed. So we would abolish the super PACs. I mean, this is a goal across the political spectrum, but it's particularly important when we think about it through the judiciary lens, right? It's supposed to be a checks and balance. We know it is no longer a check and balance because they're legislating, right? And I truly believe that if you are, if you have the honor to serve the public in a way where you get to interpret the law and influence so many lives, then you should be held to a higher standard. That should be part of the job. So disclosing that money. The second thing is ensuring that we have an enforceable code of ethics, right? Because of course we have a code of ethics, but it's not enforceable. So we need to make sure that there is a standard of conduct. So, we can prevent things like, a justice's wife from participating in an insurrection, right? And making sure that, there are not those immediate conflicts of interest. The third piece is making sure that the administrative office of the courts does a full study and releases potential conflicts of interest before a nominee is confirmed, right? And typically we do see the super PACs doing this, digging up dirt and, arguing for or against. But I do think we need a neutral body to present that evidence. And lastly, I believe that it is imperative that justices personally disclose any conflicts of interest, and then do so on a yearly basis, and with very strict and severe penalties if there is, if they either go against the code of ethics, or if there's a conflict of interest that, would make it inappropriate to continue to serve. So, we're really focused on trying to correct or fix what has become a very, very broken system. And I think we all know it. And I believe that this is a moment that it's going to be tough for all of us as a country. We're going to have, quite a few tough years, but I do believe we can get back on track and begin to rebuild trust, but it's not going to happen unless we have a wholesale system change.
So I want to take this to Larry, but I think that the reforms that you're mentioning, Melanie, dovetail with Sheldon Whitehouse's reforms about trying to root out dark money on the court, and also dovetail with a piece of legislation that Elizabeth Warren and Pramila Jayapal have introduced into the Congress, which is called, I hate this title of this legislation, it's called the Judicial Ethics and Anti-Corruption Act. But that too is trying to enact some of the reforms that you talk so eloquently about. Larry, you seem to have some doubts about, I think, the enforceability of such legislation. Would you want to talk about that?
Yes. Everything Melanie said, the response would be, who could disagree with that? Well, there was nobody here. And it's all terrific, but enforcement is going to be next to impossible. What are the penalties? Well, once again, let's circle back to how many Supreme Court justices have been removed. There was a Supreme Court justice, Ward Hunt, in the 19th century, who had a stroke and was helped in, put in his chair, and was totally unaware of what was going on. And the only way they got him off the court was they granted pensions to justices when they reached 70 years old, which he was, and Hunt left the court. Samuel Chase, who was a brilliant legal mind, was totally involved in politics and was doing everything he can to thwart Jefferson's agenda. And he was impeached and was acquitted by Jefferson's Senate. The problem with all of this is the mechanisms that you would need in place to enforce it. And one of the problems with enforcing a mechanism, congressional or even independent, against your judiciary would be a violation of separation of powers. Now, do I believe it would be a violation? No. I think everything Melanie said is dead on. I just don't think any of it will actually, the dark money stuff might, but that's a whole different, getting money out of politics is a much larger issue than just the court. But the ethics and disclosing a conflict of interest, what happens if Clarence Thomas said, oh, I don't think my wife's involvement in an insurrection was a conflict of interest? Who's going to enforce that? What are they going to do? The only power currently to discipline the court is impeachment and conviction, and that just isn't happening. So yeah, I think it is worth doing. I think it is worth trying, but I'm not really optimistic on it working.
Catherine, can I make a response?
Of course, I was just going to ask you for a response.
Oh, great. Well, I appreciate Larry's response. And while it is all absolutely true, here's what I'll say. When we talk about court reforms now, I mean, I'm campaigning, so I am at events nearly every night. I'm on the doors nearly every night, and I can't even tell you the frequency with which it comes up, right? So now this discourse has moved from, political circles and political rooms and activist conversation to everyday conversation. This is a dinner table conversation now. So I think, something really has shifted in our society, and for better or worse, and Larry, you and I don't know each other that well yet, But you know, I'm a big believer in just because something hasn't happened doesn't mean it can't happen, right? And so while I definitely think it's important to look at the history, it certainly helps us understand the biggest picture. It helps us understand the challenges that we face and the hurdles. It doesn't mean we don't try, and it doesn't mean that we can't succeed. And you know, I hear that you know, some of what you said, but you've actually phrased it much better than most. I hear sometimes folks say, well, we would never be able to convict Clarence Thomas, even if we did impeach him. And I think right now, especially for our party, the Democratic Party, we're seeing kind of a weak response, right, from our government. You know, as a woman, as a mother, as someone who's given birth 3 times, you know, the issue of abortion has lit people on fire. And, you know, the fact that it's being met with a shrug and, well, we just have to wait it out and wait until the composition of Congress changes, that doesn't sit well with me, right? Because even if we don't get to convict, we should still impeach. We've got to show the party that we have values, that even though maybe the Republicans and maybe Joe Manchin and maybe Kristen Sinema won't get on board, but we need to use the power, the levers of power that are available to us right now. Even if we're not successful, we have to show that we have a backbone. We have to show that we have fight. Otherwise, why the hell would anyone want to keep voting for these Democrats who are just there sitting in a seat, taking up space and not fighting? Because right now, women are going to die. People are going to die. And we know that abortion was the first domino and many more are coming. So we need to put up the fight of our lives. And I believe we need to fight like hell. So while you know, you're probably right in many ways, Larry, I think that it shouldn't prevent us from trying.
May I?
I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry, may I?
Melanie, is you don't have enough passion, obviously. I'm sorry. Go, Larry, your response to that.
Again, who could disagree? The problem is political capital is limited. Yes, you impeach Clarence Thomas. Yes, you impeach Brett Kavanaugh. And you continue to impeach and you continue to fail. The problem with that is from a practical standpoint, from an idealistic standpoint, yeah, of course. And yes, Democrats have to show some backbone. I don't disagree with you there. But I think the backbone has to be shown selectively. I don't think that continuing to embark on political journeys that will end in failure will ultimately enhance the party. It will just look like, you know, why are these people doing it? And so other of your proposals, fight for expansion, you bet. Fight for term limits, absolutely. Fight for ethics, your idea of having a legislative act, sure. But be aware that the more you do and fail, you lose power by doing that. You don't gain it. Yes, you have to show other Democrats it's worth coming out to vote, and nobody would say do nothing. But I do think that the certain degree of selectivity is going to be more effective than simply going after everything.
Yeah, and that's a fair point. But to counter it, I would say, you know, maybe our selective impeachment process doesn't impeach all of them. Maybe we just go after Clarence Thomas. Let's look at the data. I mean, the FBI investigation that never was quite finished on Brett Kavanaugh. Let's see what's there. You know, both of these justices, in my opinion, are not fit to serve. I'm not saying we shouldn't be strategic and smart about it. We absolutely should. But I also would point to someone like, look at like a Bernie Sanders, right? Now, he did not get the presidential nomination. We could have a whole discussion on that. It would probably take a day or two. But and he tries all kinds of legislation. He tries to pass I think real transformative legislation all the time, and he often fails. But when we look at him, what's happening with his support? It's growing, it's growing, it's growing. He's reforming the Democratic Party. He's ignited a fire within people. He has inspired people to run for office. So I think, you know, it depends on how it's done. Right. I think that there is merit and there is purpose to fighting a battle that you ultimately may not be successful in. But I think there's a complacency right now within the party. I mean, I was shocked. I was at an event and Kirsten Gillibrand, who I generally think is, pretty strong, she shrugged and said, there's nothing we can do. I know voters are mad, but there's nothing we can do. We're just going to have to wait until we have more control in the Senate. Nothing we can do. And Catherine, I know I'm out of time, but I just want to throw another point out there. I know this is about the courts, right? And that you're right, Larry, like maybe we don't necessarily go full bore on all of these policies we talked about tonight, but let's think about the consequences of this, right? So Roe v. Wade is overturned. I still have trouble saying that. I still somehow don't believe it. But why can't they ratify the ERA? Like, do something. They're doing nothing here. So I think my point is more that we've got to show people that we've got that fight, even if we lose. Because if they're good fights to take on, and like as you know, the ERA has been a fight for decades. Let's re-energize people. Let's bring them in. And we know that's what the politics is about, the long game. We very rarely get a quick win. It's about the long game. So we've got to be strategic and go for it.
So I just want to ask, unfortunately, Melanie has to hop off in 10 minutes. So I want to ask you an important question, Melanie, about the viability of the reforms. Let's just talk about expanding the court, which to me, it seems to make so much common sense and historical sense. And Larry has laid it out very well in articles that he's written. And I think you've laid it out very well. When you talk about this in forums and debates, and that while you're canvassing, could you tell us what sort of reaction you're getting when you talk about it in those forums to expanding the court?
Yeah, absolutely. It has sort of surprised me because, as I said earlier, we all hear, the counterpoints. But what about the Republicans? But what about this? Or how viable is that? What I have found is even in more conservative neighborhoods, when we start talking about my plans for how we could address the Supreme Court, what we could do to claw back our reproductive rights, people are so excited, and we often get their vote just by talking about court expansion. Even in places like Great Neck, which really shocked me. But polling shows, and I'm not a huge fan of polls in general, but polls show that this is an overwhelmingly popular issue. I'm shocked that I'm the only candidate in my race that's supportive of this reform. But I also, I'm the only. Well, I guess there is another candidate that's a woman, but she doesn't really show up to the forums. But typically in these forums, it's myself and 3 men. And, they often shrug and want to wait it out. And I don't think they feel the same urgency as I do, right? As a woman, as someone who has 2 daughters, knowing that, the Supreme Court just essentially said that I am less than, that my daughters are less than, that anyone with a uterus just doesn't count quite as much. So I feel a fire within me to fight and do everything I can to claw our rights back, because I think it's absolutely absurd that we're at a point where people are not equal. We don't have the choice. Our choices of what we do with our body is not equal. So when we have these conversations, even with men, women, it doesn't matter. They're like, yes, that's what we should do. That's what we're missing. And I think, my message resonates with people. As you're seeing, I'm a little bit of a fighter, and I've got some passion, and I'm ready to go, and people see that. And I think that's what they're wanting right now. They don't want someone that's going to go and, get along to get along. They want someone that's going to fight for the interests of our people, for the interests of our communities, for the sustainability of our democracy. That's what people want right now. And it's been a very positive experience at the doors.
So in the short time you have left, I'm going to bring up the issue of a huge issue that we could spend days on, which is the issue of judicial review, which is one thing that's not in your plank about the Supreme Court. Larry, briefly, could you just explain why judicial review is not in the Constitution and it should be on the table in terms of thinking about a new way of seeing the court's relation to legislation?
There was no possibility. When the judiciary was debated in the Constitutional Convention, it was very clear that the delegates would never, ever, ever have delegated to the court, even if it was term limits and the power to judge the Constitution. There were two great legal philosophers at the time, William Blackstone and Baron de Montesquieu. And the conservatives like Blackstone and the liberals like Montesquieu, which by the way still exists. Both of them said the court should never be able to overrule an act of the legislature because it leads to despotism. So let's, without going in, I wrote a book on this, so I could go on for days, but let's just hypothesize or assume that judicial review was not the intent of the delegates when Article 3 was written. In 1803, in Marbury versus Madison, John Marshall, the third or fourth Chief Justice, depending on whether the crazy guy counts, essentially hijacked that power in a purely political case in which he was trying to keep his seat because Thomas Jefferson was going to impeach him. They were cousins, by the way, and they loathed each other, was going to have him impeached and replace him with a friend of his named Spencer Roane. And Marshall was faced with a problem of either ruling for a Federalist colleague or allowing and being impeached, or allowing Jefferson to kind of win and keep his seat. And what he did was he kind of snaked through it. And it's a brilliant, I'm not going to go into it, there's an article about it, but the power of judicial review, even from a theoretic standpoint, these guys spent 4 months in 90-degree weather. They didn't like each other. The windows were sealed. They were dressed heavily. They smelled. They spent most of that time trying not to give any branch of the government more power, the power to overrule the other two. The idea that they would give the Supreme Court the power to decide what the Constitution said is ridiculous. So both from an analytic standpoint, if you read the stuff, and from just a logical and rational standpoint, the power of judicial review was taken by the court in Marbury. And again, it's like term limits. No justice wants to give up judicial review. They like ruling on constitutionality. And in most cases, the court has ruled for conservative interests, but like in Obergefell, ruled for liberal interests. So it's a very difficult question, but it ain't in the Constitution.
So Melanie, AOC is actually talking about legislation to limit judicial review. Is it something that you have considered when you've been thinking about your reforms for the Supreme Court? Or is this too big a thing for you to fight off at this moment?
At the moment, Catherine, we've got a lot of legislative priorities that we're, still formulating, but with 2 weeks left, it's not something, I think it's obviously, and, I like to really get into the details and understand the consequences and unintended consequences, and what that could potentially look like with a rogue legislative body, right? So it's not something that I have bitten off just yet, but that's not to say it's off the table.
So I guess that gets to a question that Catherine Soka asked, which is if Roe were codified in Congress, and Melanie is calling for that, would it stand? Would this court try to overrule that through judicial review? Larry, what do you think about that?
I don't think so. They can go, they go pretty far, but to overturn an act of Congress, to say that abortion is that the right of abortion goes against the Constitution. There's nothing in the Constitution about, even if you would admit that abortion is murder is a state crime. There's no federal crime for murder except in very specific circumstances. So I think that in this one, if the Congress passed it and the president signed it and we had a law guaranteeing the right to an abortion, I think that the court would have to gnash its teeth, and I think they would reject the case.
Okay, Melanie, you can keep that in your plank, and I know you now need to go to a meet and greet. So thank you so much for bringing your customary policy chops and passion to this discussion. I knew that you were going to be a great addition.
Good luck, Melanie.
Thank you so much.
Larry. Really enjoyed listening to you. Hopefully, maybe Catherine can connect us. I'd love to stay in touch. And Catherine and the rest of Peer, thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to be here. Thanks for the work that you do, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you, Melanie. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Catherine. Bye.
So, Larry, people keep being angry at me because I don't ask you a question that they keep sending to me, but I just wanted to make the most use of Melanie's time that I possibly could. Do you think that the nominating process can be reformed? Is that feasible? No. Okay. Why do you think that?
Because first of all, the nominating process is in the Constitution, and it's very specific. The executive, they debated it, by the way. They didn't know, they weren't sure how to appoint justices. Some people said that the Senate should do it. Some people said that the state legislature should do it. But it's a very specific, there you have a very specific objective as opposed to subjective process. Now, if what you're really talking about here is not who gets nominated, but who gets approved. And that is, if you go back to the Nixon years, 2 guys in a row didn't get on, Hainsworth and Carswell. And Robert Bork did not get on, which is kind of started this whole partisan nominating. But the actual process of nomination, no. That's what the Congress is for. The Congress is there in theory. The Senate is there to say, you just nominated somebody who's, working as a lobbyist, for an oil company or something, and no, we can't have that. Remember, Robert Bork, on a scholarly level, was immensely qualified to be on the court. He was a really smart guy, and his training was outstanding. I personally think it was a wonderful thing that he was not on the court, because he was as conservative as any of these guys, and he was kind of angry. He was an early Scalia, but that process, that nominating process, kept him off the court. So no, I don't think that there is any way to reform the nominating process in any meaningful way. I think the president nominates who he wants to nominate, and then what you could do is enact certain standards in the Senate, but even then, you're back to enforceability. So I think we're stuck with what we've got. Look, Clarence Thomas got confirmed. What can I say?
I remember it vividly, Larry.
Yeah.
Catherine Soka, we have a problem here that we're both called Catherine. So Catherine Soka has a good question that is frequently debated, although I don't know what good it does us to debate it, but it'd be interesting to hear your opinion. When McConnell refused to hold hearings, even hearings for the Garland nomination, is there anything that Obama could have done? I mean, I heard the suggestion that he could have made an interim appointment, for instance.
Nope.
Nothing
No.
at all.
No. See, that's the problem. If you are going to game the system, we are dependent on people believing that we want a democratic government. We are dependent on people believing that we want majority rule. Unfortunately, we don't have majority rule, we have minority rule. The Constitution was written to ensure minority rule, and this minority wields immense power, which if they lose, they know they won't get back. So no, Obama there was no power to appoint an interim justice. This is not an executive department. This is a separate branch of government. You can appoint an interim secretary of state. You can appoint an interim, Trump appointed interim, he can appoint an interim brain surgeon, but you can't appoint an interim appointee. There can't be an interim appointee for the judiciary. They all have to be confirmed. That is in the Constitution. The problem here is, if you're saying, how do we keep them from gaming the system? And the answer is, under the current rules, we cannot. All we can do is to try to gain control That's how you keep him from gaming the system. McConnell can't game the system now because he's minority leader.
So I want to go back to the expanding the court issue, which I think is such an important one. Jerry has the question of how you would actually implement expanding the court to 13. Do you want to talk about that, Larry?
It's easy. You pass legislation. There was legislation in 1869 that set the number of justices at 9. You revise it. You revise it to 13. Problem, of course, is you've got to pass the House and you've got to pass the Senate. And since it is not budget reconciliation, you need 60 votes. Or you get rid of the filibuster.
Get rid of the filibuster.
Now, here's the good news. Wait, let's have a little good news. I think the Democrats have a very good chance of increasing their majority in the Senate by two votes. I think Ron Johnson's in real trouble. I think Dr. Oz is not likely to win. I think that the Trump nominees, anybody who wants Trump to leave the national scene, forget it. Without him, Ron DeSantis is much worse. If you increase the number to 52 and you've got 50 people willing, you then can eliminate the filibuster for certain acts, because they can do it. They can eliminate the filibuster. They eliminated it for budget reconciliation. So the good news here is, even though there's trouble in the House, and I'm usually the cynic in the room, and I think it is much too early to give up on the House, and I think the Senate is looking not so bad. If you increase the number to 52 and you keep the House, which is not impossible, you can pass legislation, simple majority in the House, 52 votes in the Senate, eliminating the filibuster for this legislation, and then send it to Biden, who, even though he said, no, he doesn't want to do it, he doesn't want to do it. If that legislation hit his desk to expand the court to 13 justices, he would sign it, because his presidency, if he doesn't, his presidency is over, because no Democrat would vote for him again. And so I don't think this is necessarily bad news.
So it's good to hear some good news. We really need it. One of the purposes of this meeting is to discuss what's possible, and you and Melanie have both helped with that so much. But I think that we have a challenge about normalizing the discussion of expanding the court in particular. You write for major publications. How do you think we can normalize that discussion? Because it still is not normalized for most people. They still think it's radical in some way.
What you need to do is someone needs to approach people like Linda Greenhouse, who writes a weekly column for the Times, Robert Barnes, who approach the serious Supreme Court columnists. I mean, I'm serious, but they get more readers in one breath than I get in my life, and get this into the mainstream. Get this as a discussion, and discuss the precedent, and keep it out there. I remember everybody used to throw in Texas, everybody threw stuff out of cars, and they couldn't stop it. They passed legislation, they increased the fines. They had 2 linemen, this is in the 1990s, from the Dallas Cowboys, one black, one white, who did a commercial and said, Texans don't trash on Texas. Within 2 weeks of that commercial running, littering, people throwing stuff out of cars, dropped 75%. It is a question of keeping something in the public consciousness and getting it in there by the right people. Look, I wish it was me, but it isn't. But Linda Greenhouse, certain congressional people, not AOC, because frankly, she's radioactive. What you need are people in the center discussing this in a serious way and keeping it in the forefront. And then if things work out in November, then you've got a discussion that is already been had, and groundwork that's already been laid. That would be my best guess.
Well, I think that's a terrific idea. If there aren't other questions, I have another question. Are there other questions, Julie? Julie? Are there other questions?
No, actually, you covered them all.
Okay, so my other question is, there are a whole host of other reforms out there, some which seem pretty wild-eyed to me. Are there other reforms of the court that you've thought about or you think people should think about, other than the ones we've discussed today?
Well, there are a lot of the things Melanie brought up in terms of financial disclosure. Yeah, that would be great. But I just don't think they're workable. Again, going back to the disagreement I had with Melanie, I think you don't walk in with a quiver full of arrows and shoot all of them. If we could get term limits and court expansion, you might not need as strong an ethics bill, because people are there, and also you would not disqualify the next Supreme Court nominee is going to be a 13-year-old far-right junior high school student. Because I was interviewed. I did a thing with my book Inherently Unequal at Williams & Connolly, which is a big-time law firm in Washington, and I was interviewed by a woman named Allison Jones, who was in their constitutional law department, and she didn't know anything. I was stunned. She married some guy named Rushing. At 36 years old, she was nominated to the circuit court, and she is now a circuit court judge nominated by Trump. So what you've got is people, in fact, I wrote a piece recently on people being nominated to the court only because they're young. Clarence Thomas, I disagree with people, and I disagree with Gorsuch, and I really loathe Alito, but Clarence Thomas is a dunce. I mean, he is just plain dumb. If you listen to him talk, this guy shouldn't be dog catcher. But he was the second youngest man ever nominated to the court in the 20th century, other than William O. Douglas. And so I think if you do term limits, and remember, they can't be applied retroactively, but if you implemented term limits and you expanded the court, I think that would solve 95% of the problem.
And how would you implement term limits? I actually am a little dubious about the term limits idea. How would you?
Act of Congress, same thing.
No, I know, but I mean, what would the term be, for instance? And
I always thought 16 years. 2 full well, if you're assuming a presidential cycle is 8 years max, then that's 2 full presidential cycles. So a justice will serve through at least 2 presidencies. And I think that works, because then if it's too short, then they're going to worry about being reappointed, and you need a right of reappointment.
Right.
But act of Congress, I would just do it straightforward and dare the court to declare unconstitutional a rule implemented on them. What I said before in a joke, but it's true. None of them could rule on this because they're a party to the action. They would all have to disqualify themselves.
So I just have one final question, because we're nearing the end of the meeting. You said earlier that you felt that the sort of thing that's going on with this court, which I think is a quite radical court, has precedent. But it seems to me that in particular, if they rule that state legislatures have the only power to rule on elections with the Moore versus Harper case, that they're breaking democracy effectively. Can you think of another court that has done that? And if they start ruling that I know that the New Deal, the court that served during the New Deal did this to some degree, but if they start ruling that effectively executive organizations like the EPA can't regulate anything, isn't that something that is more fundamental than any court has done before?
Giles v. Harris, 1903. Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote a decision that basically allowed Southern states, it was ruling on the Alabama Constitution, which disenfranchised all the Black voters, people who have been voting for 20 years, Giles v. Harris, Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote a decision that said, yes, the Alabama Constitution is corrupt, but we can't do anything about it because then we would be part of a corrupt action. It was a totally absurd. Richard Pildes, Pildes, who's terrific, wrote an article on, I've written a lot about Giles v. Harris, but he wrote it about the road to anti-democracy. I think I think the democracy is already broken. I don't think we ever really had it. The only time we came close was during Reconstruction, when that was the closest we had ever come to true majority rule in this country. And a little bit maybe in the 70s and 80s. But what this court is doing is turning that all back. So I think that letting state legislatures be the only control, I think that's a problem. But again, Democrats win control of the state legislature, they're going to do the same thing. I don't think it breaks democracy. Well, it does, but I think a lot of other things break democracy. But I think what it does is lead to the kind of polarization that will really destroy the country.
Right. Well, on that happy note.
Hey, I gave you a piece of good news. You didn't end on it.
Yes, okay, indeed. We didn't end where we should have.
Seriously, watch the Senate. It is not impossible that Democrats could pick up 4 seats.
And let me just step in if I might. And first of all, Catherine, thank you for moderating that very interesting back and forth between the two. And it was great to have both opinions on the opposing opinions on the issue of the ethics. But listen, Larry, thank you so much for being here.
It was a pleasure.
I think you've just brought up the fact that if we lived through the 70s and the 80s, we lived through an unusual moment in the court's history. And so now we're almost seeing what it was like previously. But we've also talked about the way forward. I mean, that's what we wanted to do tonight. We wanted to talk about, we wanted to put in historical context what had happened, discuss what's recently happened, and figure out some ways to actually right the courts. And I think you and Melanie agreed on a number of things that actually we may be able to do.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
I want to encourage everybody who's here to copy the chat, because there's a lot of really excellent links in it, starting with Francesca Rhiannon's link to a conversation that she had with Larry on Writer's Voice, and other organizations that you can go to get more information about the courts. Where you can go to support Melanie, and where you can go to get Larry's books and read his articles. So I really want to yeah, I dropped that. Please, did you have something, Larry, that you would like to?
No, I thank you. Thanks for having me. I had a great time. Melanie's terrific. I don't disagree that you really got to fight. If you want to do it, we disagreed a little on tactics, but not the overall approach.
Great. Yeah, and Allison has dropped in the chat the races to watch. So that's terrific to know. And I know that Tina wanted to share with us an announcement about a book group. So Tina, if you're still on.
Could I just, before we leave this topic, I just wanted to say something encouraging that happened when I was phoning for Melanie. One night I was phoning for her, and 3 different people asked me where she stood on expanding the court. And you can be a little nervous when you answer such questions for a candidate whom you're supporting. And I said trepidatiously, she's in favor of expanding the court. And all 3 people said, well, then I'll vote for her. So I think that says a lot about people wanting solutions, even solutions that some people think are radical. Those people were going to vote for a candidate because she was in favor of expanding the court. So that's something encouraging for you, Larry.
Yes, and I would counsel her to add, I would like to go back to the fundamentals, to the early republic, when there was a justice for every circuit. I think linking it to the origins of the judiciary would be something that takes it away from appearing radical.
Yes, yes.
I want to go back to the way we were, to Alexander Hamilton.
Yeah. That's a great point. And I just want to also let everybody here, especially from Long Island, know we do have an opportunity to elect 2 women onto Democratic women into Congress. Melanie, we've got to help her on August 23rd because she's got a tough primary. And then come November, Melanie and also Bridget Fleming from CD1, where many of us live.
Would you do me a favor and say hi to Bridget for me?
Will do. Absolutely. Thank you. And so Tina, please, if you're on, you wanted to talk about a book group upcoming. She's here, but she's muted. And perhaps she's no longer here. So,
I'm gonna sign off then.
okay, listen, and thank you, Larry, and good night to everybody.
My pleasure, really. Thank you for having me. It was great fun. And please tell Melanie good luck.
Okay, thanks so much.